Hello, dear students. Welcome to What, Why, How, a daily initiative by IAS Baba, where we take up a daily topic or a current affair and we try to declutter it in less than 10 minutes. The topic that we have chosen today is primarily an editorial that has featured, and the topic of the editorial is that India's steel frame does need a check. Now, those who are not aware, India's steel frame is actually a term that is used for the bureaucracy in our country. Now, this editorial goes on to identify the different challenges that are there in the Indian administrative service and also what is the need for any kind of reforms that are there to make or to improve this service. Now, to understand this topic, let's first understand why we even need to understand the relevance of civil service. See, in India, we have something that is called as an executive led governance. Executive led governance means that in India, you have certain groups called as the legislature that initially spearhead the policy creation. Once the policy is created, the rest of the entire thing about the policy goes on to the executive, which means the executive has two major functions. One, they have to create the finer details of the policy or the practical details of the policy, how it will be put into action. That is going to be getting created by the executive. Also, what also can be seen is this policy has to be finally implemented, and that role is also given to the executive in our country. As you can see, if this is the case, there is so much power and so much resources that the executive in our country gets because they have two important functions that is needed for the governance. Now, if the executive needs to do all of these things, obviously, even if they do have the power, they also need the different kinds of human resources. And the human resources of the executive come in the form of your IAS, IPS, and the other services, primarily but your IAS service. The IAS is actually a remnant of the colonial Indian civil service. After the independence, we retained the service primarily to ensure this policy implementation and to create the finer details of the policy. So the idea is when in our country rapidly things keep changing. Now each 5 years you might have a different government, you might have different crises coming in, different things that can change the landscape of the country. But what remains is the frame of your bureaucracy, the frame of your executive, which is your IAS officers, because whatever changes, this remains still. Now, here is where the catch is. It's constantly now being said that the steel frame has now rusted. And what is the reason? Some of the reasons why your IAS is not working up to the mark is because of certain aspects of political interference. So, when I'm saying political interference, in the policy implementation stage, you might have politicians interfering, they might not be able to keep the policy in its stacked phase, or they might not be able to implement it in the proper phase because there's constant threats, constant carrot and stick thing that is happening with respect to the politicians. Then the next important thing is the politicization of the IAS. Politicization of the IAS means that ideally the promotions, the transfers of IAS officers should be on a merit basis. But what has happened is, over the time, this has gotten politicized. That means if you are in close ties with any kind of political party or the ruling government, maybe all of these aspects related to your career can get sorted. And this has led to IAS officers being just neutral on paper, but in fact having clear political alliances in the background. Then you have the lack of specialization, especially in a world where you have very specialized sectors coming up, like your digital security, you have e-commerce, you have different aspects of health. In all of these things, you have so much of specialization, but the IAS officers are trained to be like a jack of all trades. That means their major point is they have to be generalized. And this can be a problematic thing. Added to this, outdated personal practices like having very incoherent transfer policies can also be problematic. Finally, the centralized power structure in our country often sidelines the bureaucrats' insights because the policy, as I told you, the finer details also have to be created and the implementation also has to be done. But in the creation of the finer details, it is mostly overtaken by your political powers, and then IAS officers are just left to be policy executors. And this can also be problematic. Now, if the why part is all this, the editorial primarily talks about what can we do to maybe reform this structure because the steel frame cannot remain rusted. And this is where, in the recent times, there was a concept called as the lateral entry. The lateral entry does not solve all the problems of Indian bureaucracy, but the lateral entry can clearly solve the problems of lack of specialization. But nevertheless, there were a lot of protests met because the process of doing lateral entry was not transparent enough. Anyhow, what has happened is this lateral entry has been implemented to a small extent in the senior bureaucratic positions, and right now only 33% of joint secretaries at the center now belong to the IAS service. That means you have people from the private sector incorporated into these senior posts because they can bring their learnings from your private sector, like your how to run something in a very efficient manner, how to run something in a cost effective manner. All of these things are the lessons that they bring. And once these lessons are brought into Indian policy governance, it will be having wide reaching consequences. Apart from this, the editorial also suggests in US there is a department that is now suggested called as your Department of Government Efficiency, which is now focusing on cutting wasteful expenditures and introducing accountability mechanisms for bureaucracy. Maybe something of a similar sort can also be effective in our country. Previously, there was widespread information given about the Civil Services Standards Performance and Accountability Bill. It came about in 2010, but after that, there was not much discussion about it. Maybe a bill like this can also ensure the principles and the values that the civil servants should focus on in this new digital age. Finally, when it comes to any kinds of transfers or promotions, etc., a robust data infrastructure to track bureaucratic performance, enabling any kind of decisions with respect to placements, promotions, policy implementation. If these things are done based on data, this can incorporate so much more transparency into this service. I hope you've understood the crux of this editorial. Most of the elements of this editorial can be used in your GS4, in your GS2 papers, etc. So I hope you've understood this topic in detail. Until we meet next time, take care and happy learning.